Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Bread of Life channel. I'm so excited to have Matt here with me. Matt has a degree in apologetics, and he runs a discussion group called Coffee Shop Apologetics. So just to kind of set this up, well, welcome, Matt. How are you?
Good. How about you?
Good.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. And just to kind of set this up for you, what's been kind of going on my channel for the past few weeks is that we've been discussing the design argument. And, I'm not much into philosophy, but I'm a big fan. Well, okay, I was a big fan of the look at the trees, guys. Can't you see God in the trees? And then people have been telling me, somebody sent me this quote from Pascal that was like, saying like basically like saying that when we speak so confidently about this, hey, look at the great things that God has created, then it's actually making the proofs of our religion look very weak. And so for some people that don't have that design intuition like I do, it makes it seem like if I'm saying that's a very strong argument, then to them it seems like it's that I have nothing at all to offer. And so we've kind of come to the point where some questions were presented and some ideas were presented that I didn't have an answer for. And I said, okay, you know what? Nathan, Danny, Lance, and Kim, you guys have presented me with some reasons to kind of that I need to step back from this design argument. But all of these guys are atheists. So I wanted to hear from a Christian who's into philosophy. So that's what I wanted to have you on for.
Well, it sounds good. Yeah, I appreciate that. It's funny you say that because it reminds me of in the Screw Tape Letters, which was written.
Mhm.
It's fiction, but through the fiction, C.S. Lewis said a lot about what he thought about the world, and he had a character in the Screw Tape Letters that it was a woman, and back in his day, I mean, this is like a generation or two ago, and women tended to stay at home, and he said that the woman who was staying at home could be persuaded that atheism and people who are antagonistic to Christianity were all very foolish, only because she'd never met them, And so as soon as you start meeting and discussing and having conversations with people who are thoughtful and who come on the other side, I think that you start to get more of an appreciation that it's not just, I want to go do what I want, and so I don't want to believe in God. There's a lot more to it than that. And I think that if we're going to, represent Christ, and that is respect and love all people, who need to pay the other side the respect of hearing them out and listening to what they have to say, even if we end up disagreeing at the end. At the end of the day, if we're not making connections with people, then what are we doing? And so I definitely think that I can understand why there's a segment of Christianity that hasn't met people on the other side, and as a result, they end up thinking all these crazy ideas about this group of people who don't believe in God. The horror, and it's just it's not that way in the real world. And so I'm glad that there are channels like yours and others that give opportunities to both sides so that they can meet each other in cordial and polite environments and have those discussions that help us to build a common ground and come to a mutual understanding.
Cool. And from what I understand, your Discord discussion group is a place like that, right? Like you have people from different perspectives that are coming together to discuss these ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. And my channel is a little bit different in that I wanted it to be a place that's not me. It's about the community. So as a result, I actually rarely present. Anybody who's a part of the group, if they want to stake a claim and defend it, I call it Coffee Shop Apologetics, which shameless plug. That's the website, coffeeshopapologetics.com. And basically, it's meant to be a place where Christians and non-Christians can meet for cordial and polite discussion. And so the way that we typically spur that is by having a featured event so that a speaker, and anybody can be a speaker, just says, hey, I think this view, and they put what their claim is. And then we set up an event for them, and they can just say, hey, here's this claim, here's why I think it. And then we just do, most of it's just Q&A, which is just like cordial conversations with people. And I allow Christians and non-Christians to speak. Just this last Saturday, someone wanted to give their presentation or their claim that the Bible contains false prophecies about Jesus' return. Perfectly fine with that, and so I definitely want. I think that there's a lot of forums out there that are just toxic, and it's just, and I've tried to do outreach in some of those environments, and it's just draining. And so I think we definitely need to have environments where people can have conversations without feeling like, oh, this is just giving me a headache, So yeah, that's what I try to do with the server. And if anybody is interested in learning more about it, you can go to coffeeshopapologetics.com. It is relatively new, so unfortunately it's not discoverable yet on Discord, but if you go to that website, I can get you plugged in.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And let us recognize that the atheist of the month, it has arrived. So Titan, Uranus, we're glad that you're here. And I also wanted, Matt, before we start, and by the way, guys, we're going to have a special guest on in a few minutes to join us for this conversation. So guesses in the chat on who it's going to be to help this conversation along. Okay. But Matt, could you tell us, can you tell us a little bit about your story of faith? Because I read just a little blurb on your website, but I would like to hear more about that.
Sure. So I grew up in a very conservative Christian household. It was Southern Baptist. And, it was definitely one of those bubble type environments, and as I got older and as I, was turning 17, I was about to get out of high school. I was getting more independent to where my faith needed to not just rely on my parents, it needed to become my own. And I just started to have doubts. I'm like, why do I think any of this is true? Why do I actually think that Jesus is real, that Jesus rose from the dead and all this? And I met with friends, I met with family members, I went and met with a pastor and just asked them that question. And other than the pastor, they couldn't give me any sort of reasonable response. It was just, well, I just know it's true. And it's like, okay, well, I don't, so what am I supposed to do with that? And when I met with the pastor, the only response he could give me was, well, if God doesn't exist, then there can't be any meaning in life, which, okay, well, then maybe God doesn't exist and there's no ultimate, transcendent meaning in life. Like, that doesn't mean that there is a God. It just means here's a consequence if there wasn't a God. And so none of them could really give me any sort of answers. And I ultimately did deconstruct my faith and became an atheist just before going to college. And originally I was studying biology in college, and I was studying it as an atheist. And I was actually, oddly enough, struck as an atheist at sort of some of the anti-Christian bias that was in there. I had one professor who said, hey, we're teaching evolution today. If you're a Christian, you can have whatever beliefs you want, but in this class, we're going to teach the truth. And it's like, okay, that's a bit pejorative. But but actually, as I studied, I was studying the human cell. And I remember vividly in my cellular physiology class, and I'd gotten into my fourth year, my cellular physiology class, I was opening a textbook and I was looking at the surface of the human cell. And it is absolutely amazing. Absolutely amazing. I mean, if you've ever seen any of these like YouTube simulations of the inside of a cell, those are radically dumbed down. I mean, it is just amazing what's going on in the cell. And I didn't have the language for it at the time, but I remember just looking at it in my textbook and thinking, this is never just going to fall together like this, no matter how much time you give it. So I came to believe that there must have been design in the human cell, that there had to have been an intelligence because of what I found there. And granted, like I know that there's probably people in the chat thinking, oh, you know, that's horrible, all this, but to be honest with you, I can just tell you, like I studied it for years. As an atheist, I was not trying to find God. I was struck by what I found there. And so that had a dramatic impact on me. And as a result, some other things were going on in my life, and I ended up returning and recommitting my life to Christ about 6 months later. And having had that experience, both the experience of family members and friends who had, were very well-meaning, loved them all very, very much, but just didn't have any sort of response for me. Having that experience, and then having the other experience of actually finding, like, wait a minute, there is evidence out there, really, put me a passion for Christian evidences and for, why we believe that this is true. And so I transferred my credits ultimately to Luther Rice University, where I got my bachelor's degree in religion and my master's degree in apologetics. From there, I've gone on to volunteer with Reasonable Faith. I had help with Dr. Craig's Overflow Q&A. So if you write into Dr. Craig, he gets a lot of emails. Sorry, everybody. But he doesn't answer them all personally. And so I'm part of an Overflow team that if he can't get to a question, they'll route it to the team that I'm a part of, and we'll give you some sort of response. And then recently with Cocked Up Apologetics, I've been trying to foster those kinds of conversations.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing your story. Well, the chat has spoken, and Deepak says, Danny, duh. And the only other guest that was put on here was Canadian Catholic. That is incorrect. Yes, our special guest is dun, da, 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 Danny. So welcome, Danny. And this is great that Danny's here because, guys, I mean, to be honest with you, these design things are kind of like the philosophy stuff is over my head. So Danny's going to be here to kind of like ask Matt questions, I think. Or how do you want to do this, Danny? Do you want to ask questions, or do you want me to ask questions and then you fix stuff up or push a little harder or something?
Yeah, I mean, I'm fine with whatever. I guess I could frame the problem as I see it.
Okay.
I'll frame it the way I originally said, and then maybe in a different way. But
cool.
I do have a different version of the fine-tuning argument. I've rehashed it, basically in response to I saw a discussion between Alex Malpass and Luke Barnes on Capturing Christianity, and felt they could be improved upon. And so I do present a modified version, which, if you want to hear that first, maybe some of the objections wouldn't apply if it's to a different argument.
Yeah, it's up to you. I think it will still apply.
Okay.
But if you feel like there's something different that I'm not aware of, then maybe we should start with your rendition. But I guess in the end...
Yeah, let me run the show here. So whatever you guys want to do.
I mean, I think it's fair that I hear the argument first, then before I'd take down a straw man, right? So what you can go ahead and give me how you understand a design argument or fine-tuning argument, and then then we can go from there, I guess.
Okay, sounds good. Now I will say that the underlying reasoning is similar. I'm more trying to make more explicit why we're making a design inference. In particular, Alex Malpass asked on his channel, asked in the interview, he said, well, if the design argument works, then it seems that whenever we find some radically improbable event, it'll be evidence for design. And I thought, no, something hasn't been made explicit. And that's why he's saying that, is because it's not been made clear. And so that's why I wanted to try to make it a little bit more clear. And obviously having a background in biology and an interest in that, I'm very familiar with Stephen C. Meyer's work. And I think he adds a lot of language that's helpful here. And in particular, the language is specified complexity. So it's not just complexity, it's specified complexity. So what is that exactly? Well, there's two components, obviously. Specified complexity, there's the specified part and there's the complexity part. So complexity is basically just when various different, disparate components come together in a particular way. And so, for example, if I took a baseball bat and I hit a window, it's going to make a pattern of cracks, right? Well, that pattern of cracks is complex. There's a lot of different ways that it could have cracked, but it cracked this way. And so it's complex because there's a lot of different lines that make this pattern. And so that's complexity. Now, complexity by itself doesn't imply design. I didn't design the pattern in the window. I just hit it with a bat. And I don't know why I'm using a destructive example, but that's what came to mind. And so that's not complex. Now, what if I hit the window with the bat and the cracks formed this perfect and it said Danny, right? Well, if you saw that, you'd think, okay, this is a magic trick. This is like a street performer. Like, what is this? And the reason why is because it's not just complex, because it's a series of cracks, but it's specified to some external standard or set of criteria. In this case, it's specified to your name, right? So it's got complexity, which is one half of it. Then the other half is it matches this external pattern, which is Danny's name. And there's nothing about Danny's name that has an influence on how cracks form in windows, right? So that's external. It's not causally related. And so we have specified complexity. And we find in our lives that when we find specified complexity, we have a design inference. So for example, if you've ever used a debit card before, you punch in 4 digits and your bank recognizes that the 4 digits entered match the PIN number that they have on file for your account, and they release your funds. So what's happening here? Well, you entered 4 digits, so it's complex, but it's specific to the number that you have on file. And they bet so much on that being a guarantee, or at least an implication, a strong implication of design, that they're willing to release the money in your bank account. And we see this in language and various other arenas. And so when we find specified complexity, we have this design inference. So then we look at fine tuning. And for those of anybody in the audience who isn't that familiar with it, fine tuning refers to, and I wish there was a better term for it than fine tuning, because people think that implies design, just the term, but it doesn't. All that it means in physics is that there's a number of different constants and quantities that fall within very narrow life permitting range. So for example, if gravity were just a little bit stronger, then there wouldn't be enough there wouldn't be enough neutrons, so that all of the protons would be locked in helium, and you wouldn't have chemical reactions. And whatever we call life, helium, just a gas, is not alive, right? And so, or if the dark energy were just one part, and I think it's 10 to 108 more, then everything would be pushed out. Dark energy is what pushes the expansion of the universe. And you would just have hydrogen and helium floating around, occasionally bumping into each other, and then off into nothing, empty space for 1 trillion years. And again, a solitary hydrogen atom is not alive. And so you have all these different sort of, cataclysmic scenarios that would happen if these constants and quantities vary very, very slightly. And so you have complexity. There's like 10 to 12 physicists. Physicist Luke Barnes identifies 10 to 12 of these. So there's all these different things that all come together in making this pattern. And what does that pattern match? Well, it matches the needs of conscious embodied life. And so we see that there's a lot of ways for that to go wrong. And so it's complex, and it's specified to conscious embodied life. And so as a result, we have a design implication. And so basically my position is, I'm not saying that, Danny, you have to become a believer. We're not doing a baptism after the stream. What I'm saying is that fine tuning justifies belief in God. So somebody can rationally look at fine tuning and they can say, yeah, that looks designed to me, and they're doing something rational, and it's a reasonable conclusion to draw. And I think that that's, again, justified by a specified complexity.
All right. So I guess I'll start with the problem as I see as a whole, and then I'll zero in to some of the stuff you were saying. The original problem that I posed was something like, if what is it that we're using, or whether that be a set of criteria or some kind of example, to differentiate between something that's been designed and something that has not been designed, right? But of course, that's in the form of a question, really. Really, if you get to the essence of the question, the force of the question, it's something like this, right? That if it's possible that you have a world where you have a set of physical facts, all of what that may be. It could be constants, it could be biological properties, whatever. Okay. You have that set of physical facts, and God explains those physical facts. And if you have another logically possible world where you have the exact same set of physical facts, right? But God does not explain those physical facts, how is it that how can we know which world we are in? And part of the problem is that to know which world we're in, we couldn't appeal to any of those set of physical facts, because those set of physical facts are going to be consistent with the God hypothesis, and as well as consistent with a non-God hypothesis, or not God world. Okay. It would be like this. Suppose we're wondering if we're in a dream. Okay. Or we're in a matrix where there is some kind of intelligent being behind orchestrating our experiences, or we're wondering whether that's not the case. It'd be weird for me to do this. It'd be weird for me to say, look, Matt, we are in fact in the matrix because look at this phone, right? Or look at this set of physical facts of the phone, right? There is a specific type of complexity to it that would lead us to believe that there is an intelligent thing orchestrating our experiences. Okay. But the thing is that you appealing to your experience when that experience is consistent with a world where you have no intelligent being orchestrating my experiences. I lost my train of thought. The idea is that appealing to something that is consistent with either the hypothesis that we're in the matrix or that's also consistent with that we're actually in the real world is a no-go, right? In other words, it's an unfalse. Well, there's I guess the background issue is that it's kind of an unfalsifiable thing that we're dealing with, and by unfalsifiable, I mean that we can't empirically verify which world we're in. Right now, I'm not saying we can't know. Right, there might be a way to a priori know what situation we're in, whether we're a brain in a vat in the matrix or whether everything is real. But we couldn't appeal to the experiential facts as to rule out one over the other. So that's kind of the tension that I'm trying to highlight. Now, with respect to your specific example of specified complexity, okay, I think that one of the ways that we make legitimate design inferences is our background knowledge of specific types of minds and the kinds of things they do in the world. Okay, you have to have that background knowledge or else you wouldn't be able to make a design inference. So let's take your example where I take a bat and I hit a window, and after I hit the window, there spells my name, Danny. Okay, now let's say that at the same time an alien came down with a completely different psychology, with a different set of background beliefs, okay, than I do. They would not be able to infer any kind of intelligence there or a magician or anything like that, because they would not have the requisite background knowledge that phrases like Danny are associated with humans in the way that, I would inscribe Danny if I had to sign my name or give an autograph. So I think that what legitimate design inferences are, or how you make legitimate design inferences, is ultimately based on your background experience with that a specific type of mind or intelligence, and then the way that they tend to interact with the world. But in the case of the atheist, their claim is that I have no background info or of what a disembodied mind that's all powerful, all good, and all knowing, how that interacts with the world, right? So I'm not going to infer that if I hit the window that this name spells out. In fact, it could even spell out Danny, God loves you, right? The fact is that I can only the as far as I can go in terms of an inference is that there's a human-like intelligence that is orchestrating what's going on, right? It's not. I'm not going to be justified in thinking that it's a disembodied mind or it's an alien from Saturn, or specifically, or because they could have a very different unhuman-like type of mind, right? Non-human type of mind. I'm only going to be justified within a parameter of intelligence, and that's going to be a human-like intelligence, or a human, or an intelligence that's familiar with how to use the English language, right? So I think that's kind of the overall concern there broadly, and then kind of narrowing it down to what would make a legitimate design inference. And on my book, it's having knowledge with what that kind of intelligence does in the world.
I can't wait to hear your response to this, Matt, because this is what Danny and the others have been beating me up with. One of the things. I have to give you Lance's objection in a little bit too, but I can't wait to hear your response.
Sure. You say Lance. Is it Lance Hannestead?
No, Lance S. Bush.
Oh, okay. Lance Hannestead is also like very active in these conversations.
Okay.
Anyway, doesn't matter. Sure. So I've got a few thoughts on that. So first of all, you started off by saying, how would we tell the difference between a possible world where we've got all these design evidences, we'll call them evidence or data points. Maybe that's more neutral. How would we tell the world between the difference between a world where we have all these data points and it is designed by God, or at least it is designed, and a world where we have all these data points and it's not designed? So as I see it, is that's basically like, what if we had evidences A, B, C, and the conclusion follows, or versus A, B, C, and the conclusion does not follow, right? Or the conclusion's not true.
I would have to understand what you meant by that.
So basically, like, if we're making this implication of design, then if the difference is we've got this world where we've got evidence A, B, and C, and the conclusion we're drawing is true, versus a world where we've got A, B, and C, but the conclusion is false.
Yeah, and we're wondering,
how do you tell the difference between the two?
Yeah, I guess, yeah, that might be a way to put it. I guess the way I would understand it to be, just in case we're not talking, to make sure we're not talking past each other, is that if you have physical facts A, B, and C, if the physical facts A, B, and C are consistent with the God hypothesis, but also consistent with the not God hypothesis, how is it that we can appeal to those A, B, C properties to rule out one hypothesis over another?
Yeah. So I think, are you objecting to me referring to them with the word evidence? Is that,
well, if
all you
mean by evidence is something like the physical facts, because the constants, biological properties, these are physical facts. So I'm saying that if there's a problem of underdetermination, that's the fancy philosophical term here, is that all physical facts, whether it be these constants or the properties of a cell, are going to be consistent with the God hypothesis as well as consistent with the not God hypothesis.
Okay. It sounds like I have understood you correctly, and I've kind of paraphrased it well. It sounds like we may just be having a semantic disagreement. I want to make sure I'm understanding your view, because basically what I said was, if we've got A, B, and C, and the conclusion is true, versus A, B, and C, and the conclusion is false.
I think that's right. I mean, I'm just saying that it's yeah. If you're, how do we know what we're wondering what the conclusion is, right? That you and I mean, I am saying that there's an epistemological problem here. Okay, you're saying there's not. That we can look at.
Well, so far, I haven't said anything. I've just tried to summarize what you've said and make sure I'm doing it justice.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is that take all the set of physical facts, right? That's going to be consistent with the God hypothesis. It's also going to be consistent with the not God hypothesis. And because those physical facts are underdetermined, you're not going to be able to appeal to those physical facts as to rule out one hypothesis over another. That's the position. Yeah.
So there's, again, I do want to use a label, because it's just, I mean, if we keep saying physical facts, it's just going to like get tongue tied, right? So I think that using a variable like A, B, and C, is that what you're objecting to? That you want me to say physical facts? You don't want me to say A, B, C? You want me to say these lists of physical and biological facts each time? Is it the labeling that's the problem?
I'm fine with the label. I'm just saying that for any physical fact, right? So physical constants, biological.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
The variable can be very broad.
We can just call any facts. We can just use the word facts as because I think part of the concern is that intelligent design wants to count, and maybe you're not from the ID theory camp, but ID theory wants to count as a scientific endeavor, a scientific mode of inquiry. So we're going with the set of physical facts, and we're making an inference to the best explanation, right? Okay. And here, yeah.
I'm not trying to publish a scientific paper. I'm just having a conversation with you. And yeah, from my part, I'm just using a variable A, so that it can be very broad, or it can be just essentially to summarize the points. And so I do think that it seems to me like I'm understanding you. And I don't know if you intend to be objecting to me phrasing.
I don't know. I'm just making sure I'm clear. I don't think there's anything that you haven't misrepresented me. I just want to be very clear. I think you said ABC and conclude something that's true versus false. I just thought the way that I phrased in terms of these
Okay,
facts.
maybe conclude. We'll say claim, right? So the claim that God exists versus the claim God does not exist.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
we've got,
and the facts are going to be consistent with both.
okay, so we've got a world where there's ABC and the claim is true, and we've got a world where there's ABC and the claim is false. Is that?
Yeah, that's fine. I'm
Okay.
sorry. That's what you meant to say.
I'm glad we diffused the problem. And so basically what that amounts to is saying, other than the evidence, what's the evidence? And while that's true, because other than ABC, which is the evidence, so other than ABC, what's the evidence? And so while that's true that other than the evidence, there is no evidence, I don't know that that's necessarily helpful in the conversation. That's the first part. And the second is that's going to equally apply to every claim, right? So if you're a defense attorney and you're going into court and the prosecution has laid all this evidence, they've got fingerprints, they've got DNA, they've got a photo of you murdering the person, and you've ABC, you've got all these evidence. And so you say to the jury, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, how would you tell the difference between a world where all of the evidence that they presented is there and my client's innocent versus all the evidence and my client's guilty? So clearly you can't make a decision. Like, well, no, that would not fly, right? And so stipulating that, well, all of these things would be just so and there's no God, it doesn't really address the issue. It doesn't really, well, yeah, it's true that if all of these things were true and there's no God, then okay, I guess we'd be wrong. But epistemologically, we would still be justified in inferring that God does exist. It would just happen to be the case that in that world we'd be wrong. The justification would still be there because A, B, and C still implies the conclusion, even if it ends up being false. And so I will certainly concede that it's possible that we're making this design inference and we end up being wrong. I don't think we are wrong, but I'm certainly willing to concede that that is a possibility.
Yeah, I don't think this is going to be true of all cases. I think there is something very legitimate that you were saying, but just to kind of say that in terms of all the physical facts being consistent with God, the reason what might explain that is that God is all powerful. He can bring anything about, right? Anything that's logically coherent, he can make true. But with this case of humans, right?
I haven't made a claim like that tonight.
Oh, okay. So do you, I'm just saying that if we're entertaining whether the God hypothesis versus the not God hypothesis, then I thought that was what the two competing views.
Well, so technically speaking, I haven't actually claimed that God exists. I've claimed that fine-tuning implies a designer. That is to say that we have this implication that there's design behind these constants and quantities.
Yeah. So if you're saying that all the physical constants and laws are going to be, it's reasonable to believe that that an intelligence best explains them, right? That intelligence is going to have to be over and above the physical facts, right? Because the idea is that,
in the sense that any conclusion is something you infer from the facts, so it's not contained in the facts, it's a conclusion from the facts. So yeah, certainly that's true of all conclusions.
So the intelligence that would be responsible for all the physical constants and laws couldn't have any physical limitation. So couldn't be.
Oh, I agree.
Right.
I think you made a great point, Danny.
Yeah. So if there couldn't be, if there's no physical limitations, given that that's the only kind of limitation that a mind could have, you're talking about God.
I certainly believe it's God, and that's, given the context of our conversation, sure. But notice what, and I hope the chat spotted that. I didn't say God. Danny said God. And what Danny said was, well, yeah, but if there's a designer, then that designer must be God. And so I completely agree with that, that God would be the best candidate to be that designer. But I just want to say that that's a conclusion that Danny's reaching from the evidence that we've discussed. That's not a conclusion that we assume in advance and then we go and look at the evidence. But no, he's deducing, what do we infer about this designer from the things that he's designed? Namely, he can't be material. He can't have these physical limitations. He's got to be incredibly intelligent. I don't think it gets you all the way in that argument to like omniscient, but nonetheless, vastly intelligent. He must be powerful enough to enact his design. And so there's a number of conclusions we can draw from the evidence. But I do want to just point out that what Danny's doing here is he's not starting with God and then running to the evidence, but but rather he's taking God as a conclusion from the evidence. And so I think that's an important distinction to be made. A lot of people think like, well, you're defining God into existence. Well, no, we're reflecting on what's predicted, or maybe not predicted, maybe predicted is a loaded word, but what's inferred or what's implied by the evidence that we present. And we start to get these attributes that are consistent with the concept of God. And that's what I think we can do with the fine-tuning argument.
Yeah, I'm not saying that the constants count as evidence so much as if something explains them, they can't themselves be constrained by physical constants and physical laws. So we're effectively talking about a disembodied mind, right?
Yep.
And the problem with disembodied minds is that they don't generate any predictions as to count something like the physical constants and laws as they are, right, as evidence for that kind of thing. Right.
Yeah. So now you've kind of reversed the arrow of the dialectic. What I mean by that is you've drawn a conclusion that follows from, and we'll call it evidence at this point. I think we can at least go that far.
I know what you mean by evidence. If you just mean data points or physical facts, then I totally understand.
Yeah, data points from which I'm drawing this conclusion. And so when we reach a conclusion, whether that conclusion has predictive value or not is irrelevant. It follows from the evidence, and so that's the conclusion.
But it doesn't follow from the evidence. I'm not saying that.
Right? Well, I know you're not saying that, but it's just the nature of the case that with these arguments, when you end at a conclusion, if the conclusion does follow from the evidence, if it does follow from the evidence provided, then it follows whether you like it or not, whether you find it useful or not, whether it's predictive or not, because it's a conclusion that you're following, that you're arriving at. And I think the reason why this comes up a lot is because typically what you'll do in scientific inquiry, in fine-tuning, it deals with physics, it's the scientific field, is that you'll take two different competing models, and these models will make predictions, and the models will factor in things like the equations and the state of events and the scenario that they're in, and it'll make a particular prediction, and you compare the different predictions, and then you go and test those predictions. And that's typically how you prove a scientific model. I'm not presenting God as a scientific model. I'm presenting God as a conclusion that we reach through these arguments. And so whether he's predictive or not is somewhat irrelevant, because I'm not trying to say that he's this model that we need to govern our physics by or govern our science by. I'm saying, in fact, one of the things that got science started was they held this belief that God could do whatever he wanted. And so we had to go out and find out what he has done. We can't, from an armchair, infer from God what he will do. We have to go find out what he has done. Obviously, there were a lot more Christians in the sciences back then. But at any rate, so that's why I think like whether God has a predictive value or not is I think it mistakes the dialectic and what we're doing here in the conversation. I'm not saying God best predicts fine tuning. That's not the argument that I'm making. And so whether God predicts or doesn't predict is somewhat irrelevant to our conversation.
Well, I think it's relevant in that evidence is parasitic on predictions, right? What counts as evidence, on my view, is that what you would expect to see or expect to be true, given a hypothesis to be true, right? So for instance, if there's a horse in my room, right, there's a concept, right, of horse that makes predictions about what there would be or what I would expect to see if I were in my room. And that were true, right? There would be this hairy animal that's larger than I am, or at least, if it's an adult, let's say an adult horse with a tail and whatnot, right? There's all these predictions that's sort of derived from the concept. And so seeing a furry animal, right? A large furry animal is going to be evidence for the hypothesis or the truth that there's a horse in my room. So I don't know where we would be if you're divorcing predictions from evidence.
Yeah. So the problem is that, again, at that point, you have a lot of truth that's true and we're justified in believing it, but without evidence. And so I think you've got somewhat of a too narrow view of evidence. Let me give you an example. And this is going to be from like philosophy undergrad type stuff, right? Where they'll actually make up words in philosophy classes to kind of demonstrate some of the different rules of inference. And so let's say like, and this is going to sound silly, but it is what it is. All glorps are Shazams. All Shazams are Tweedles. So therefore, all glorps are Tweedles. That's a deductive argument, simple modus ponens, right? Nothing is predicted by the claim all glorps are Tweedles. I've literally made these words up. So it has no predictive value whatsoever. They're made up words. But nonetheless, that's a conclusion that does follow from the premises. And so what do we do if we have these conclusions have no predictive value at all? Surely there are things that we can know that have no predictive value.
Yeah, those are a priori concerns, right? I'm saying that evidence is construed in an a posteriori way. It's true. I don't think take a simple example of I think that 3 is an odd number. There's no evidence for that. Like there's nothing that we would expect to see in the world.
3 is a non-number?
A priori. What?
You said 3 is a non-number? What do you mean by that?
Odd number?
Oh, odd. I'm sorry.
Yeah. 3 is an odd number, or you just gave the law of transitivity, right? The way that I understand evidence is that there's not going to be evidence for that kind of stuff, right? It's not like we have to empirically verify that 3 is an odd number, or that there's the law of transitivity there's some kind of conclusion from transitivity.
Perfect. And if I can just, if you don't mind me, I want to camp on that for just a second. So what we would have then is we have these models in science that predict what would happen if we varied these constants and quantities, right? And so that's where our evidence come in. We can have as a conclusion from the scientific inquiry that that these constants and quantities fall within very narrow life-permitting ranges, right? I am certainly happy to conclude or to say that our rational inferences, the process of rational inference, is an a priori thing, right? You can't make an argument for arguments, right? You can't do that. And so there's a priori, we can kind of just see these rational inferences that arrive from it. And so I think the same thing happens with arguments for God's existence. Is you have these evidence and these scientific conclusions that support premises that then plug into an argument for God's existence. It's
not going to be deductive. It's going to be, since it's a posteriori, it's going to be inductive.
Yeah, an inductive argument. But the point is that inference, that inference process, happy to say that that's a priori, and that's not something that is necessarily scientific. It's no less true any more than all glorps are Tweedles, right? But the science part, the predictive part, would come into justifying these premises, and then we would get to the conclusion, the result of the premises, based on our a priori understanding of rational inference. And so I still think we can know the conclusion, even if that conclusion has no predictive value, because we're getting there through this rational inference. Just like you got to the conclusion that if there is a designer, he must be immaterial. Well, how did you get there? What evidence did you have? Well, you didn't have to have evidence because you can see the rational implications.
Yeah, if you're using the word evidence to mean that which supports the conclusion, then I understand what you're saying. I'm just saying that classically speaking, I like to distinguish giving an argument for and giving evidence for, right? I don't give an argument for, with respect to whether transitivity holds, I don't give evidence for that. Right?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. And my claim at the beginning was just that we're justified in believing that God exists. Whether you want to say there's evidence for it or whether you say there's not evidence for it, that, as I think you're pointing out, may be more an issue in semantics. But nonetheless, we can still have the conclusion that we're justified in believing that God exists on the basis of fine-tuning. And
so go ahead, Rebecca, go ahead.
Well, I just thought this would be a good time to jump in with Lance's objection to the fine-tuning argument. So this was kind of brought up in a group one day. Okay, so Lance said, but why should fine-tuning be evidence for God? He said, and Lance, I'm so sorry if I'm butchering this, but he's like, actually, to me, it would be better evidence for God if things weren't finely tuned, because God doesn't need all those natural laws and all these things to achieve his goals, right? If he has all the power, he can do anything he wants. So, why would we see all these physical constants and parameters that have to be just right? There's no reason that they have to be just right if God is creating the world. So he's like, actually, if there were no rules and constants, then that would be much better evidence for me that God would have to exist, because there would have to be a supernatural cause for our existence.
Sure. So the objection seems to be that if God exists, he could cause the life permitting ranges to be broader than they are, perhaps like infinitely broad. That life
Mhm.
could somehow be more adaptable than it is.
Mhm.
Now, I certainly agree here in principle that even though I don't know what that would look like, I don't have any in principle objection to the claim that God could have made life and nature work very differently than they do. That said, it doesn't undermine the argument at all. The idea is we find specified complexity and we are justified in inferring design from that specified complexity. And we find the specified complexity in nature, therefore, we're justified in inferring design. And so I don't see how the claim God could have made it such that specified complexity is unnecessary undermines that line of reasoning. We would still be the case that in the actual world, we do have the specified complexity and we have the design inference that follows from it.
I think this is sort of related to my objection. I think that if we're reiterating Lance's objection, it's that if what if you're saying that the physical laws and constants were placed by God, right? Um, then to accomplish, let's say a life permitting universe, right? Uh, well, why would God need laws and constants if he's all powerful? He could just actualize a state of affairs where everything is life permitting without the laws. So it seems like, if anything, right, you could even say that these physical facts or constants laws are actually evidence sort of against a God that is perfectly rational, because why would he need to create superfluous facts, right? Like laws to create a life permitting universe when he doesn't need to.
Yeah, so I think that sort of an objection just assumes a lot more than you can possibly prove. And namely, it assumes that you can make judgments about divine intent. So you have to be able to say that if God existed, then he would want to create such and such type of world, or he wouldn't want to create such and such type of world, like a world like ours. And so my argument hasn't made any sort of reliance on a particular divine intent, but it seems like the objection does have to make this inference. And so for me, I would just say, like, well, I don't have any reason to accept the claim that if God existed, he would want to create a world where there wasn't specified complexity and fine tuning. And so I don't have any reason to take that objection seriously. So that would be kind of like one response to it. The other response would be, it could be the case that God has more goals than just conscious embodied life. He could want conscious embodied life and things like redemption and relationship. And it could be the case that fine tuning and creating a world where we have evidence for God's existence from fine tuning will lead people into that redemptive relationship. It did with me. And so I can see how there could be the case that God would want to create a world where we can point to things like this and infer his existence. And so I certainly don't think that it's impossible that God has reasons for wanting to create specified complexity. But even still, like, all of that being set aside, the claim being made is we have fine tuning. Fine tuning represents specified complexity, and specified complexity justifies a design inference. This other possible world that people are imagining, it doesn't undermine any point in that argument. And so that's why I say it doesn't seem to interact with the argument that I presented.
It seems like this is a good time to put this question up because you mentioned specified complexity. So Dr. Dan says specified complexity can result from non-directed process. This has been done experimentally. So it's not a valid design criterion. Does Matt have a response to that situation?
Well, it is somewhat interesting to say that you've got an experiment which is undoubtedly designed to show that you can have a non-designed result. I don't know how to read the paper. I don't know what experiment he's referring to. But what I would say is, again, I'm saying that specified complexity justifies a design inference. It doesn't require that all instances of specified complexity are designed. It could be the case that, if trying to give an example. If something is true 90% of the time, you're justified in believing it's true on the next time, even though there's a possibility you're wrong. And I've never at all said that there's no possibility that I'm wrong, that there's no possibility that this conclusion is false, even though we have this inference. And so all it would have to be the case is that, usually when we find specified complexity, most of the time when we find specified complexity, we can make a design inference. And we see that whenever we passport protect something, whenever we have language, and even if we, to use Danny's prior example, even if we encountered an alien spaceship, right? We've got no background knowledge of aliens, depending on who you are, background knowledge of aliens. And so, but we can still infer that there must be an intelligence, even if it's an intelligence that we know nothing about. We can still use that specified complexity to infer intelligence. And so it needn't be the case that every time there's specified complexity, for it to nonetheless be the case that specified complexity generally justifies a design inference.
I just want to get to the heart of the issue. I think I feel like we're a little bit derailed because I think I had to, I was starting with entertaining the God hypothesis, but then you made the point that I'm not talking about God. And then from there, we've kind of meandered through what the nature of evidence and specified complexity and all of this. I think that all I'm trying to say is that I think that the physical facts are underdetermined when it comes to disembodied minds, right? So do you think that the physical facts, like whether that be physical facts about specified complexity or laws of nature or constants, right? Do you think that there's a problem of underdetermination?
It depends on what you mean by underdetermination. I do think that your line of reasoning earlier was correct, that the intelligence that we would see behind these physical constants and quantities must be immaterial, which would entail that it's disembodied. And so I think that that's a conclusion that follows. If by underdetermined, you mean, does it follow with certainty? Can I know it like I know that 1 + 1 = 2? I'm not at all.
And that's not what I mean by underdetermined. I'm saying that underdetermined is a problem where you're looking at a data point and you're wondering for the explanation for that data point, but there's all these hypotheses that could explain that data point. So you could not use, so the data point is underdetermined. Okay. You would need a different data point, right, in order to rule out one hypothesis of another. And if in this case, in the God case, what the data point is just the set of all physical facts. So in order to overcome the problem of underdetermination, you're going to have to appeal to a non-physical fact or some like a logical truth or mathematical truth, let's say, right, to rule out certain hypotheses over another. So I just want to, in that sense of underdetermination, do you think that all physical facts are underdetermined with respect to the hypothesis of disembodied minds?
Do I think that there's a problem of underdetermination in there? No, I don't. I think that you can always, for any set of data, you can construct a skeptical scenario against the conclusion that follows from it.
That's just not true. Look,
if
we're wondering who created the sun, right? The thing is that we can rule out human beings because human beings have physical limitations, right?
No, you can't rule that out. You brought the Matrix earlier. What we see as the sun could be some program created by the architect to lock us in our prisons, right? I mean,
that's a good example. If you're entertaining Cartesian skeptical scenarios, there's going to be a problem of underdetermination, right?
So you can always construct a skeptical scenario for any conclusion, even there's a sun, right? And so the mere fact that you can construct skeptical scenarios about the conclusion or that there's other possible explanations is just irrelevant to me. All that I want to say is that we've got fine tuning. It is an instance of specified complexity that justifies a design inference. As you pointed out, we can make certain inferences from what sort of designer that must be, and those implications entail that it is a disembodied mind. And so I don't see how, because you could, I mean, you're not even presenting a skeptical scenario. You're presenting the possibility of a skeptical scenario. That if it's possible that I could create a skeptical scenario.
Do you think we're justified in believing that there's a matrix?
What's that?
Do you think we're justified in believing that there's a matrix?
No.
Okay. Are you going to use any physical facts as to rule that hypothesis out?
No.
Because any physical fact that you point out, right, is going to be consistent. What?
I would use the principle of credulity.
A principle. Okay. Is that a physical fact?
No.
Okay. So that means that so if I'm fine with saying that, that you can know that you're not in the matrix, but what you cannot do is say that you know that you're not in the matrix by appealing to physical facts, because physical facts are underdetermined in terms of whether we're in a matrix world or a non-matrix world. This is essentially the God hypothesis is just like the matrix hypotheses, right? The matrix example, right? if the God hypothesis is true, right, we can't appeal to physical facts as to rule out or accept the God hypothesis, because there's a problem of underdetermination, just like with the Matrix.
I don't agree.
Well, look,
like I said, I mean,
Okay,
second,
you know
Rebecca,
what?
one second, Rebecca.
All right,
One second,
go ahead.
Rebecca. Look, in the Matrix, do you agree that it's irrational, or it's
I don't agree with the
not?
conclusions you're drawing.
Yeah, I understand that. But
Because you're trying
wait,
to,
wait,
again, my
one
claim
second, one
isn't
second,
that.
one second. In the Matrix example, do you agree that it's unjustified to say that we're not in the Matrix because we are seeing certain physical facts, like in DNA?
Yeah, I would say that wouldn't be the reason you would reject the Matrix.
Right, because there's a problem of underdetermination. Seeing DNA in the Matrix is consistent with not being in a
now
Matrix.
you've put words in my mouth. I didn't say because there's a problem of underdetermination.
Okay, why is then I'm going to ask you, why is it that it's unjustified that if you look at DNA, then you conclude that you're not in the Matrix?
The reason why I would conclude I'm not in the Matrix is because it doesn't seem to me that I'm in the Matrix. There's this, and the seeming counts as evidence in my usage of the term. And so I don't think I'm in the Matrix because I don't have any reason to think I am in the Matrix.
I'm fine with that, but I'm asking a more specific question. I'm asking, why is it that looking at DNA it's not reasonable to say that, oh, because I see DNA, I'm not in a Matrix?
Well, I think that the problem is that the problem, going back to fine tuning, is
Just answer the question.
I'm trying to answer your question in the way that I get to choose my answers. The problem is, if it were the case that it was 50-50, right? That it was just as likely that you would have this set of constants and quantities if there is a God, if there's not a God, then yeah, I'd probably likely agree with you. But I don't think that is the case. And I think that's why we make this design from specified complexities, because it's if you
I'd
had
just like you to answer the question.
Well, I'm sorry I'm not answering it the way you like, but I am answering it.
No, you're not.
Danny, how is he not answering the question?
We're taking the specific question. Why are we unjustified in saying that because I see this phone or DNA, that therefore I'm not in the Matrix? And what I'm trying to push him towards is that it's underdetermined, right? The idea is that looking at this or looking at DNA is consistent with being in the Matrix or not being in the Matrix. So it's unreasonable to infer that because DNA, we're not in the Matrix. The same thing with the God hypothesis, right? You're looking at DNA, you're looking at specified complexity, you're looking at physical constants, right? It's consistent with the God hypothesis as well as inconsistent with the non-God hypothesis. So you're not going to be able to appeal to those facts as to be justified that you're in the God world or the not God world.
Well, I'm sorry for whatever I've said to upset you, Danny. I think that
I just want you to answer the question directly.
I think this line of discussion may be upsetting in a way that is no longer productive.
Well, no, it would be productive if you answer the question.
Okay.
Why are you unjustified? Why are you not justified in inferring that you're in the Matrix from just looking at DNA?
I don't think we're going into productive discussion.
How about if I answer it? Look, if I'm
Rebecca.
in the Matrix and I pick up my phone, I cannot tell if I'm in the Matrix by looking at my phone. I can't tell if I'm not in the Matrix.
Right, because Rebecca, you understand that if you look at your phone, that's consistent with being in the Matrix. It's also consistent with not being in the Matrix, right, Rebecca?
Yes, but how does this,
what that means, that's called the problem, it's underdetermined, right? He's saying is that it's not underdetermined, right? And so what underdetermined
what is not, but how does it relate to what he's saying? How does how does that relate to our situation in the reality that we're experiencing?
Yeah, so we're wondering whether we're in the God world or the not God world, right? And we're looking at certain physical laws or constants, okay? And they want to say that counts in favor of ruling out one hypothesis over another, okay? That the intelligence hypothesis rather than the not intelligence hypothesis. But that to me is a similar kind of inference as saying that looking at DNA or physical constants in the Matrix world, it counts in favor of being in the Matrix. When the idea is that those physical facts, constants or whatever they might be, is consistent with a not Matrix world. So we're going to have to use different, and I was fine with him saying that seemings or this principle of credulity that he said, that counts in favor of not being in the Matrix. But those are not physical facts. The whole ID project is saying that because of these physical facts, that therefore we can say that one hypothesis is more likely than another.
And like I said at the beginning, and I'll just reiterate kind of what I said at the beginning, is if what you're going to say is like facts A, B, and C, and we can just say, well, if facts A, B, and C are as consistent with the conclusion as with the anti-conclusion, then of course what it amounts to is, other than the evidence, what evidence is there? And like I said at the beginning, that's going to be true for any conclusion you draw. In a
No, it's not
courtroom,
going to be true for any
in a courtroom, the defense attorney can say, okay, but the fingerprints and the video and the blood and all that, how would you distinguish between all of those things being true and my client is guilty, and all of those things being true and my client's innocent?
We have background knowledge.
It underdetermines.
We have,
and so like I don't buy it. For me, I think that although it's true that other than the evidence, there's no evidence, I don't think that's helpful. And so I've answered the question. I'm upsetting, so I'm not going to keep going down that line, but.
Yeah, earlier I said what makes for a good design inference, such that in those cases it's not really underdetermined, right? Because we have background knowledge about humans existing the way that they interact with the world. We have no such background. The whole question about whether atheism or whether there's an intelligent designer behind everything is whether that kind of thing exists. So it's not a good analogy to point out to, let's say in the judge case, right? Whether certain data points are consistent or inconsistent with a particular explanation, because we're going to have background knowledge about those data points and with that kind of explanation. The God hypothesis, atheists have no background knowledge about those sort of explanations and divine and explanations.
Now, you do have background knowledge that intelligence can produce specified complexity. And so what I
Human
said,
intelligence.
What I've said was, now again, like if you encountered an alien spaceship floating in space, you wouldn't say.
I would only be justified in thinking that it's human-like. Wouldn't it be a really bad inference to think that squirrels made the spaceship? That's an intelligence, right? Is that
we have a background knowledge about squirrels, but if I found some spaceship floating in space that had technology that humans hadn't developed yet, let's say, I think we could recognize it as an alien spaceship. If you look in the movies, as soon as in Independence Day, one of those saucers came down, we knew, there's aliens invading, right? So we can make those kinds of, and we don't have to know every. The problem so what we want to make a distinction between types and tokens. So you can have a type of a thing, which is just a type of a thing, and then you can have the token of it. So let's say you've got a dining table, you've got 6 chairs around the dining table. You've got the type, which is chair. Chair is a type of thing, and then each individual chair around your table is a token. It's a token of that type. It's a token of the chair. Now I agree with Danny that we should be resistant to, or at least we should have really good reasons to add more types in. But we can't have that resistance to novelty when it comes to tokens, because we can never discover anything new. As soon as we saw a new swirling ball of gas that's on fire out in the space, we couldn't say it's a star, because it's a new token, right? So we've got to be able to permit more tokens. And what I've said was that that intelligence produces specified complexity. That's part of our background knowledge. When it comes to fine tuning, we can infer that there's this intelligence. Now, Danny, I didn't actually introduce this in the conversation. Danny followed the reasoning that, but there are these other implications that it would have to be disembodied. And while I agree with that, that's a conclusion that Danny reached through his a priori reasoning on a conceptual analysis of what attributes must this designer have. And so all that I said is that from the fine-tuning argument is based on our background knowledge. Intelligence produces specified complexity. And again, that's the token of an intelligence is human intelligence, but that's a token. The type is intelligence. And so we're justified in inferring that there is an intelligence. And like Danny said, we get to the rest of their conceptual analysis. But I don't want to upset you, and so I can see you're getting mad.
I just wanted you to answer the question, and you still haven't answered it, by the way.
Okay, well, I've done my best to answer it. I'm sorry I haven't answered it enough.
In terms of why we're not justified in thinking that DNA, therefore we're not in a matrix, there's a problem of underdetermination. The reason why, when we look at spaceships, let's say we went to Mars and we found a spaceship, right? I think that is a good design inference to say that there was an intelligence behind that. But there are parameters to that, right? We would be unreasonable to think that it was squirrels, right, on Mars that brought that about. really we're only reasonable in making an inference that it's the kind of intelligence that needs transportation, right? And that is not what disembodied minds don't need transportation, right? So you're not going to be justified in thinking that it's a disembodied mind. The point is that there's 2 points, right? Number one, the only reason why you're justified in thinking that it's an alien when you see a spaceship is because you have background information about those sort like dials and steering wheels and the kinds of things that what those sorts of things do in terms of the means of accomplishing our goals, right? And so you're only justified in inferring that kind of being. You're not justified in disembodied minds or God or powerful omniscient entities.
And we have in our background knowledge specified complexity and the causes that produce it. So I agree, and I'm
But there's a
answering your
problem of
question by
underdetermination
saying
there.
we appeal to our background knowledge, and that's
Well,
how
you
we get to
understand
All
that-
right, I feel like we're going in circles now, guys.
Okay.
So, and I told Matt we were gonna just make this an hour long. So, why don't we just like if there's any final thoughts that we want to share? I just was thinking about the Matrix thing, you know, like and kind of like applying that to this situation. And of course, I haven't thought through all this, guys. So I'm just making this up on the spot. So it might be no good at all. But like with the phone, okay, yeah, I wouldn't know if looking at the phone, if I was in the Matrix or not in the Matrix. Actually, I would, if I'm completely in the Matrix, unless I get information from the outside, unless I have something else to tell me, there's no way I'm going to be able to even figure out that I'm in the Matrix at all. Right. And so the best that I can do in the Matrix is use what I have within the Matrix. And I think that's all that we can do. You know, we have to make use of the information that we have within the Matrix or within our reality. And I think that is what the fine-tuning argument is doing. It's making use of the information that we have available to us. Of course, it doesn't give us any absolute knowledge of the source of reality, but it's, the information that we have. So do you want to say your final thoughts, Danny, and then we'll let Matt.
Yeah, I'll give
finish
Matt
it
the
off.
final word. Essentially, that what I'm trying to say, and just to recap, is that with respect to disembodied minds, like God, right, there's going to be a problem of underdetermination with respect to the physical facts. Any physical fact that you point out is going to be consistent with a disembodied mind explanation. So you have a problem of underdetermination. Now, Matt said that, well, you can do that with any data point, right? Take a data point where there's blood splatter, right? And you're pointing to the murderer as the explanation. Well, couldn't it be that aliens came down and splattered the blood and framed the murderer? Well, sure. But the way that we overcome those scenarios is using our background information in order to say, well, no, it's not the fact that aliens came in and did it. We have background knowledge about blood splattering and murder and what human beings' goals and aims are typically in these scenarios. So we can say that the human being was the murderer rather than some alien framing the murderer, right? And so what I'm trying to say is that we have no background information on disembodied minds. I have none in my prior experience. I don't think there could be any because disembodied minds don't present physical facts at all, given the very definition of disembodied minds, right? So I'm not going to be able to utilize background information as to disambiguate between the competing hypotheses. So there's the problem of underdetermination with respect to physical facts and the God hypothesis remains. And I think that's the essence of the argument that I'm giving. And I'm done with my closing remarks tonight. So thanks for having me, Rebecca. I probably do have to go. She cooked me hot dogs and
okay.
I'm gonna take your time. Thanks, Matt.
All right.
Have a good one.
Good
Bye.
night. Thanks.
Later, Danny. Yes, I mean, I would just say that we do appeal to our background knowledge. I'm making the same appeal. He said what you have to do is appeal to background knowledge. And so that's what I'm doing. I'm saying, well, look, we have this background knowledge of specified complexity. And we have a background knowledge that specified complexity is produced by intelligence. The fine tuning that we come across is not a priori, that's the physical facts. And then it was actually Danny who inferred the conclusion that, okay, yeah, but it must be a disembodied mind. Mm-hmm. And so, while the existence of disembodied minds may not be in our background knowledge, intelligence producing that cause is. And he reached the disembodied mind conclusion from conceptual analysis of what sort of intelligence things be, if there's an intelligence behind fine tuning. And so, I don't think that any part of that line of reasoning is undermined by the alternate possible world that he brought up.
Cool. Okay. Well, thank you so much for being here, Matt. I'm trying to scroll through and see if there's any questions, because there were some toward the beginning, but it might be stuff that we've already covered, and there's like way too many comments to go through it all. So if you guys have like a pressing question, please put it in very quickly. So let's see. Germania says, what incarnation is going on here? Germania, we're talking about why you should believe in God. And we're going back to the trees. Just kidding, guys. I'm being more careful with the trees now. But I would like to know what you guys' responses are. So please do leave. Leo said, why didn't you ask any of my questions? Well, when you put your questions, Leo, they were in the heat of the moment when Matt and Danny were arguing. So if you have it, copy and paste right now, because I can't go all the way back through. There's too many comments. So Deepak says, has Matt seen James Fodor's video on the fine-tuning argument?
I have not.
Okay, cool.
Sorry.
Well, maybe we need to do a 10-hour response to James Fodor's argument. Just kidding. That's a reference to bad apologetics, guys. Okay, well, thank you, everyone.
Yeah, those are long. I tried watching one on the moral argument. It was over 6 hours, and I'm like, I'm gonna die. I mean, good on them, that they could keep it up for that long, but. Okay, this is not a serious question. Let me put that away. Okay, Dr. Dan says, has Matt perused the experiments where random sequences, nucleotide or peptide, have generated functional information? Again, I'm not familiar with the experiments. I think the same guy made allusion to. I'd have to read the paper.
Yeah, Dr. Dan is an evolutionary biologist, so that's why he's asking you questions along these lines.
I do think though that one of the things that brings up is a critic could say, well, wait a minute, we do have an instance of specified complexity in biology where there's no design because, naturalistic evolution. And so here we have this, your inference relies on specified complexity implying design. And here we have a case where we've got specified complexity and no design. And so I think, and I know that's not the argument that he just presented, but I think it brings it up anyway. And what I would say to that is kind of twofold. One is, well, we're sort of assuming that there's no design in biology because of the physical facts. If there is this designer who created this world and he fine-tuned it with, we could possibly infer the intent of conscious embodied life, since that's the pattern that it's reaching, then it shouldn't be surprising that we would also find specified complexity in biology. And so it seems like those are kind of linked together as a kind of, there seems to be a connection between those two concepts, right? That we've got we've got a universe that's specified for conscious embodied life, and we've got conscious embodied life that also seems specified. So there seems to be a link there. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is, even if we could sometimes have an instance of specified complexity without design, it still wouldn't undermine, it wouldn't really undermine the argument that much, because we would still have the case that overwhelmingly, when we encounter specified complexity, we have design, passwords, language, architecture, any of these sorts of things that fit an external pattern. We infer design from it. And so it doesn't have to be the case that whenever you have specified complexity, you have design, in order to say that, well, usually when you have specified complexity, you have design. And so therefore we're justified in inferring design when we have specified complexity.
Okay, now Jerome says, what's Matt's examples of specified complexity again? The laws of physics and what else?
Yeah, so specified complexity as a concept is basically just when you have so complexity is when you have a bunch of different things that come together to form some sort of whole. The example that I used was using a baseball bat on a window. You've got all the crack lines. That's the one piece of damage, I guess you might say, and that's complex. And so, and complexity alone is not what we're talking about. We're talking about specified complexity. So how is that different? Well, if I hit it with the bat and it spelled out Danny, then it's specified to Danny's name, and Danny's name had nothing to do with causing these cracks in the glass. And so it's external, it's not causally connected. And so that's when we would have specified complexity. And so, yeah, it's a complexity that has a pattern that matches some external pattern.
Now, Matt, okay, I'm sorry am I keeping you too long?
I mean, we're a little over, but
okay. I just have one more question, because this is something that people keep asking me. So they're like, okay, you say, God created the world. So does that mean everything is designed? And if so, then how do you tell non-design from design? Like, so the example that somebody keeps using is a rock, right? Yeah. So how do you respond to this? Because I still think it's obvious, you can tell design from within a design. Like there's a God basically created everything, and there's like levels of design, right? So I still think it's clear, like you can see design within design. So in some, like in some way a rock is designed, but I wouldn't say it's like designed with like the clearest intent as like DNA is. So yeah, I mean, is that how you would respond to that, or how would you respond to that?
So, I mean, honestly, the way that I would respond is like, first of all, I agree. I think that if there is a designer who designed the world, then yeah, it's going to be hard to know that something really is undesigned. But what does that really say? Like, so let's use another couple of variables. We'll say that if something's designed, it's D, and if it's not designed, it's not D. So the question is, well, if there is this cosmic designer, then how do you tell when something really is not D? In other words, you might think something's not D, and it turns out to be D. It turns out to actually be designed. And I would just agree that, yeah, a lot of times you're going to think something's not designed when really it is designed. But the fact that we can sometimes fail to recognize design when it's present doesn't undermine our ability to recognize design when we do see it. Just like if you looked into, a dark room, you might not see an object in the room, even though it's there. But if you actually do see the object, then you can see the object. And so the fact that I can sometimes look in a dark room and not see the objects that are there doesn't undermine my ability when I do see the object to actually see the object. And so, to your point, Rebecca, that our claim isn't that we can always tell that when God has intended something and when he hasn't. The claim is we can tell sometimes, and I think we can. And so yeah, that's how I would respond to that.
Cool. Thank you so much for being here. I hope we can talk again. Thanks everybody for participating in the chat, and God bless you guys. Good night.